is over. So thank you again for joining us for today's session, VPAT 2.0 Essentials. Our speakers today are Mary Jo Muller and Glenn Meyer. Mary Jo is the Accessibility Standards Program Manager for IBM Accessibility Research. She is an accessibility expert with over 16 years of experience in the areas of software UI and development to meet the user needs of persons with disabilities. Glenn is the Program Director for the Accessibility and Aging Program Office at HP Inc. He has been involved with the Accessibility Program Office since 2000, where he guides corporate-wide accessibility in product design and development, marketing, sales, and other programs. We're thrilled to have Glenn and Mary Jo with us as today's speakers. Thank you for doing this webinar, and I'll turn things over to you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Glenn. Hopefully, Mary Jo, you're still there.
Yes, I'm still there. I have to go back and forth with unmuting myself. So welcome to the VPAT 2.0 Essentials. I am Mary Jo Muller, as it said, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, I have a Twitter account at @1 MJ Mueller, M-U-E-L-L-E-R, and Glenn is at Meyer Glenn, and it's in the PowerPoint presentation if you need to find it. And for the agenda, we'll cover today several different topics. What is a VPAT? And we'll go into a little bit of the history and why the VPAT is changing and what the process was, as well as cover what's new. And then in the form of an example, we'll go through the essential requirements and best practices for creating an accessibility conformance report using the VPAT. And we'll finish up with information on where you actually can go and get it and download it. And we'll have the longer Q&A session at the end. But we will pause briefly in the different sections so that you can ask questions as we go along.
All right, let's begin. This is slide 4. What is a VPAT? In my introductory slide here, I have a photo of an eagle owl in flight. I chose this photo because after this session, you'll be wise as an owl. I'm certainly more knowledgeable about VPAT than folks that chose not to attend this webinar. VPAT is an acronym for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. It is above all a template or report format that was created to document a product's conformance to an accessibility standard. It's deemed voluntary because it is not required by law to use the template. This, however, should not be confused with Section 508 compliance being required by law for U.S. federal agencies, or even voluntary to provide a VPAT when it is required by the customer. As many can attest, the term VPAT has become synonymous with Section 508, and that's Section 508 the law, Section 508 the standard, and a completed template or a report. So what is VPAT used for? It was created for reporting conformance of a product or service in a consistent manner by a manufacturer to an ICT-related accessibility standard. It's pre-populated with criteria and designed to be a reasonable method to document meeting individual requirements. It would also include known defects and workarounds. It's also used for conducting market research by a prospective customer to help them make an informed decision about the accessibility of the ICT that is being purchased and or developed and deployed. So who uses the VPAT? Possibly more than you think. Originally used by companies doing business with the U.S. federal government and agencies doing the market research to comply with Section 508. Today it is used by most ICT-related companies, most state and local government entities, other countries, small to large corporations, and even consumers. VPAT history. So in this introductory slide is a photo of Mount Etna volcano in Italy. And if rocks could talk, they could tell us a lot or tell us a thing or two about history. So my intention here is really not to be a historian or to repeat materials that you can easily find and read for yourselves. However, we do want to mention some of the past to help keep this topic in proper context. That was page 8 or slide 8. So now on slide 9, so why was it developed? Or what was the motivation for the VPAT? It was developed in the early 2000s to help the U.S. federal government agencies and hence the General Services Administration, or GSA, to do the necessary market research for the federal government to comply with the Section 508 law. It was developed to provide a method for documenting a self-assessment, a truthful representation based on implementation and evaluation of the product. Also, to better enable a repeatable, consistent method to report and compare conformance to the newly created technical and functional performance criteria in order to implement the requirements of Section 508. Lastly, we needed a way to address the level of support for a requirement when it's not a pass-fail matter and when there is no official test method. This was one of the more significant challenges that the group dealt with. Who created the VPAT? The VPAT was created by the Access Committee within the US-based Information Technology Industry Council, or the acronym ITI. ITI is an advocate for the tech industry, and the Access Committee was, and still is, made up of member companies interested in advancing the tech industry, and in particular, accessibility. The ITI Access Committee participated in both the original Section 508 law and standard rulemaking processes, and began collaborating with the General Services Administration and other interested parties to develop what became VPAT 1.0. The name Voluntary Product Accessibility Template and the acronym VPAT were registered by ITI with the intention that users of the template must not deviate materially from the format in order to use either of the service marks in its reports. So where did it succeed? It provided a simple, reasonable methodology for using 3 columns to list the requirements and the results of an evaluation. It enabled the reporting and consideration of each requirement individually. It provided for 4 possible answers or levels of support, and it provided a way to give more detail on how the product does not address the requirement, any workarounds, or provide any other useful information. So what needed improvement? Certainly, after almost 20 years of use, we can know and work on areas that also needed improvement. So companies were deviating from the format, yet still calling it a VPAT. The quality of the information provided ranged significantly from poor to great. There was a lack of helpful information to better enable informed decisions. And lastly, it only included Section 508. There were other standards in existence, or there certainly are now. So in addition to just pre-populating the new revised standard, we also went about addressing needed improvements like potential requirements, better instructions, etc. And now, Mary Jo.
So I wanted to break here to see if there's any questions at this point.
Looks like we don't have any in the chat yet. Please feel free to enter them in the chat as we go along. Like I said, I will make sure we address them when we do pause, and then it's nice for us to have a little backlog of questions so we're not waiting on questions to come in. So please enter them as we go along. Those of you who are connected over the phone, if now's a great time to do that unmute. That is #6. I'm sorry, *6 to unmute your line. No, sorry, #6 to unmute your line. You can ask your question and then go back on mute. So I'll give everyone maybe 15 or 20 seconds now to try that. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in. So Mary Jo, take it away.
Okay. So this slide shows a couple of butterflies, and the title is "Why is the VPAT changing?" I chose this picture because, like a caterpillar changes into butterflies, the VPAT is also transforming and changing due to a lot of factors. First off, it's changing worldwide regulations due to new laws that are happening around the world. This map shows several countries, the US, Brazil, Europe, India, highlighted to show where there's new regulations coming along, and we do need to keep the VPAT current with what's happening. So I'll go into a little more detail on the next slide. So I'm on slide 15, and we'll cover the United States first. In the U.S., a lot of people are aware that the revised U.S. Section 508 standards were complete in January of 2017. More recently, there was a correction that was published to the rule on January 22nd to add back in requirements for hearing impairments so that they have access to telephone capabilities. And the 508 is used in government procurement. It is used not only by agencies, but also by states, as Glenn had said. And these new standards needed to be incorporated into the VPAT. Some of the important changes to 508 was the fact that the original 508 standards were quite dated. They were based on WCAG 1. They were published, I think, around the year 2000, and they contained several requirements that were written to avoid limitations in the technology that was current at the time, like scripted content. It became outdated as technologies were made accessible, and also the web standards have moved along and progressed greatly since the original 508. So it was really necessary to update it to become more current. They added even more detailed requirements in order to reduce interpretation issues, and then provided the requirement in language that makes it easier to understand how to test for conformance, so they're testable statements. The revised 508 also introduced the notion of using a web standard, WCAG 2, not only for web content, but they've expanded the scope to cover non-web software and all electronic documentation, not just web-based documentation. In Europe, there's also new regulations. There's a directive on public procurement, another procurement law, as well as a directive on making public sector body websites and mobile applications accessible. And soon, it's under development right now, is the European Accessibility Act. That law early drafts show it actually could be a very strong market access law that prevents certain goods and services that are covered in its scope from being sold or provided unless it is accessible. So I'll go into a little more detail on the public procurement law, a directive, the law. It has been adopted into the regulations of several of the member states. I've named a few of them here, the Netherlands, Sweden, Italy, Denmark, Spain, the UK, and Germany, and there's more too. They are likely to use the European standard, the EN 301549 standard. I'll go into a little more detail on that standard in a little bit in its development. The likelihood of seeing public procurement requests is about 2019. In some cases, it might be earlier since some of these countries have already adopted this into their laws. Go to the next slide. I'm on slide 19.
Mary Jo, can we pause for just one quick moment? It looks like we did lose our captioner again briefly. Let's give them a moment to connect again before we move on. Thanks.
Seems to be working again.
Yeah, it seems to be
working. Looks like we might be connected again. Okay, looks like we have captions again.
Awesome.
So I'm going to switch back over to the PowerPoint, give it about 5 more seconds for anyone who needs to copy that URL just in case. Okay, back to you, Mary Jo, and everyone, we do apologize for that inconvenience.
Okay, so the second directive that I was talking about in Europe is on the accessibility of websites and mobile applications of public sector bodies. That's basically to make mobile apps and websites of government agencies and other public sector entities accessible. It currently recommends the use of the European EN 301549 standard, but it also has a directive going on, a mandate 554, which is to update the standard to include WCAG 2.1, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, which is an update being made to WCAG to include more mobile requirements as well as cognitive and low vision requirements to more completely cover those disabilities. It is on a timeline of this year in September. Member states are supposed to transpose or incorporate this into their law, as well as it has a rollout for what must comply and when. And new websites must comply with this directive by September of 2019. Old websites need to be brought into compliance in 2020, and then mobile applications, and this is because we need to have that updated standard, is later. It's June of 2021, so they're given a little bit more time to incorporate those changes of the standard. So a little bit more about the European EN 301549 standard. It was originally created through Mandate 376. So basically what they do is in Europe, there's a directive, which is the law, and then they create these mandates that are to do the standards development. So that's what starts up the standards development that's in support of the law. So this European standard was originally completed in 2015, for the Public Procurement Directive. And now it's being updated for the Web and Mobile Accessibility Directive. And so that is planned to complete in June of this year. In addition, some other changes that are being made to the European standard is there will be yet another round of updates to further harmonize the requirements in the European standard with the revised 508, because they were both being worked in parallel, and so there are some subtle differences between the two standards. So in another round of updates, they will work to address that, as well as to address some comments that were received on the European standard that they weren't able to handle before and that require a little extra work and can't be incorporated on the very quick turnaround of June of this year. So there's going to be a couple of rounds of updates to this standard. And I just wanted to also point out that in other countries, Canada, India, Japan, Korea, Australia, and other countries, they're also picking up harmonized standards with WCAG 2.1, level AA, in their policies. So this VPAT will be able to cover worldwide reporting of conformance, which is really what our aim was. And just a little bit more about WCAG 2.1. I mentioned that 508 actually introduced the broader use of WCAG for non-web technologies, and that has also been the case in the European standard as well. So that is an important thing to note, because it's a harmonized way of approaching WCAG 2 compliance for non-web technologies, and everyone is on the same page. There was actually a WCAG to ICT task force in the World Wide Web Consortium that helped figure out the interpretation of those requirements for non-web technologies. And so that's the basis of being able to understand how to apply a web standard to non-web technologies. So a little bit about the development of the VPAT2. This image is of a farm, and it has neatly laid out rows, and the farmer had to choose where to plant the different crops, and it kind of reminded me how we approach the development of the VPAT2. It's intended to be a very practical way to report conformance to the latest standards used by policies around the world. We started this work early while the 508 refresh was in progress. It was started in 2014 by the ITI committee that Glenn referred to. As industry members, IBM and HP were two of the several that were involved in the development. We took input from a survey that we put out to the public and got feedback from various collaborators, as well as we did some collaboration with the revised 508 transition team, because we really wanted to understand some of the pain points and try to resolve issues and make the VPAT better and work better in this new version. So the VPAT 2.1, it includes the three standards we were talking about. It includes WCAG 2.0, the revised 508 standards, including the correction published in 2018, and the European EN 301549. And it can easily be updated when these standards update. And so we will keep it current as time goes on. So one of the big questions everyone tries to ask and is sometimes difficult to answer is, when will you be asked for the new accessibility conformance report based on the VPAT 2.0? Well, in the US, US federal agencies are already required to comply with the new standards. And all I can say is that soon vendors who sell to government agencies will be asked to provide the VPAT 2.0 format conformance reports, though it's somewhat dependent on the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council rule that they're developing. It's under development right now. It's in progress. It's kind of a closed process. We won't see it until they release it for public review. We anticipate that it might happen sometime during second quarter this year, though we are not sure. I know that with a new administration, things can sometimes get very backlogged, and but since agencies do already have to comply, it would make sense for them to begin procuring products that conform to the new standards, the revised 508 standards. So I expect some agencies will be early adopters. Around the world, I can say that IBM and other vendors have already received requests in places like Canada and Europe for the new accessibility conformance report based on VPAT 2. So it's happening, and it's in progress. Like the uptake of anything new, it generally takes a little bit of time, but definitely that's the direction that world conformance reporting is moving.
At this point, why don't
So I think
pause?
we can break.
Yep, sorry.
Yeah, we can break.
So we did have one question come in from Mary Ann Edmonston already, and I think she was just looking for some clarification whether you were referring to WCAG 2.1 or 2.0.
On which part? I'm not quite sure which slide she's referring to, because I was talking about both. I mean, right now.
I took note it was roughly around slide. It was roughly around slide 22, 23 when you were discussing WCAG.
Okay. So, all right. So yeah, I'm talking about what is being used right now is WCAG 2. WCAG 2.1 is under development, so it won't be done until June. So all these standards are still changing. As of June, the European standard and WCAG 2.1 are in the process of being updated. So those are not what's required now, because those are still under development. They're not finalized. That was a good question. I wasn't clear on that.
We do have one other question from Heather, and just a reminder for those of you over the phone, that's #6 to unmute. We'll give you a couple seconds after we answer Heather's question to do that if you need to. So Heather asks, could you define ACR for clarity?
Yes, ACR is Accessibility Conformance Report. Glenn had it on an earlier slide, but it's a new term. Everybody's so used to referring to these reports as VPATs, and it may be like trying to change from using the word Kleenex for tissues, but our feedback from government agencies is they didn't like the use of the word VPAT because the acronym stood for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, and the voluntary and the template part they felt it was confusing to ask for something that meant it was a template when what you really are producing, what vendors are producing, is a report of their conformance to accessibility standards. So we changed the name of the report that you produce. Once the template is filled out, then it's called an accessibility conformance report based on the VPAT 2. So they know that you're using that new VPAT. But like government agencies will start asking for an accessibility conformance report, or ACR. So we want to kind of familiarize folks with that new language.
And we actually cover that a little more in just a minute.
All right. Those of you over the phone, we'll give you a couple of seconds now. That's #6 to unmute, or you can send your questions to at webinars@accessibilityassociation.org. Okay, I don't see anyone unmuting, so let's move on.
All right. So what is new? The things we've talked about so far kind of led us up to this particular point. In this introductory slide, I have a photo of a landscape at the dawn of a new day. And this is slide number 28. So is it a template or is it a report? What do we have here? To address the concerns that Mary Jo talked about with the use of the term voluntary, we now better differentiate between what is the template and what is the report. So in this particular slide, I'm already calling it 2.1 because we did add the new TTY, or not new, but TTY requirements to what we were calling VPAT 2.0. VPAT 2.1 is actually not on the website yet, but it should be shortly. So the difference is just the TTY, the 4 TTY requirements. But VPAT 2.1, or when we use that name, that's the template, right? When you fill it out, like Mary Jo was explaining, it becomes an accessibility conformance report. And we actually use that title in the template or in the report format that's at the top. And of course, for people that like acronyms, they've already converted that to saying ACR. And so you will hear people also start to use that particular acronym. So is it okay for you to still call a report a VPAT? Sure. That's okay. I think people will do that. But just keep in mind that that VPAT, or Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, is really the report format. It certainly includes instructions. And then when you use that template to create a report, then it really becomes an accessibility conformance report. So probably one of the more important improvements that we made is in providing better information. We heard that loud and clear in the survey and from all the folks that we collaborated with. So we established what are identified as essential requirements to include in the report. These are basically must-haves. If you don't have them, then you should not reference the template. You should not call it a VPAT. You should not use the service mark because you do not have the essential requirements. After essential requirements comes best practices that explain what makes a good report. We received important feedback for both of these areas, and we incorporated them in what is available on the ITI website. Lastly, we built in instructions to help address consistency and quality. And just a note, it's not necessarily always obvious, but the instructions are part of the template, not really part of the report. So when you create a report, you can certainly remove the instructions or the very top section or the several pages that occur before the actual template starts. New fields. A majority of the feedback that we received resulted in new and improved fields of the report. These primarily occur at the top of the report or the header of a report. These are things like product description, So in addition to a title of the report or a product name, a lot of times you can't really tell what that is from the name. And so we were asked to include a field for someone to describe the product, give a little bit more detail so the reader will understand what this product is all about. Another important section, evaluation methods used. We received this as feedback to provide some level of detail. There's a minimum amount, and there's also guidelines on best practices for discussing the evaluation methods used. So the very important field that was added. Conformance level definitions. This isn't necessarily new. I think it might have been removed from the VPAT 1.0 template at some point, but we felt it was pretty important to include the definitions of the conformance levels to provide a basic understanding of what each of those support levels means, or conformance level means. Application standards and guidelines. We include a section now where you can, if you so choose, to include reporting in one report the conformance to a number of different standards at the same time. So you can indicate at the top of the report that this particular report includes conformance to the following standards. And so you can include that if you so desire. We have notes fields that occur in various places in the report. Certainly there's one at the top where you can explain some more about your product or any important information that you feel would help the readers to understand the product and the evaluation. There's also notes fields that occur embedded within each table. So if you don't include a section because it was not applicable in a note section, you can explain the reason why this was not applicable and the reason why it's removed to help make the report shorter, right? Do things like that. And then lastly, we did provide a place for a legal disclaimer at the bottom, because typically that's pretty important for a company to provide a legal disclaimer, which of course is primarily, and I'm not a lawyer, but I would describe it as a statement that basically says, I'm sorry if I have a mistake. So what's not new, right? So one is the table that I had mentioned early on. We have a table format with 3 columns. That's certainly not new. Pre-populated with standard requirements. That's not new. We felt it was pretty important to include how the requirements should be listed. Sometimes that's easily discerned and sometimes not easily discerned. In the revised section 508 standards, we actually double checked with the authors of that standard to make sure that we had listed the requirements, each of the individual requirements correctly, and we did get an affirmative from them. Conformance levels, certainly that's not new, the concept of having conformance levels, because it is not a yes, no, pass, fail typically for just about all the requirements. And we have a remarks and explanations area where you can go into more detail, explain about how the product does or does not meet that particular standard. So with that, we'll pause and stop again. Does anyone have any questions over that material or anything we presented so far?
Those of you over the phone, this is your chance. #6 to unmute. Looks like we do have a question coming in from Rachel, so we'll give her a couple of seconds to type that in. Okay, Rachel asks, when is VPAT 2.1 expected to be posted online?
This is Glenn. So I would answer that by saying really any day. So it's in the queue of the ITI of website developers to post it. So any day. I wish I could give you a better date.
Yeah, it just became effective as of, I think, yesterday or the day before. So as far as the requirements that were reestablished in the revised 508 standards because they had to put it out for a certain period of comment. But now that that's done, yeah, it should happen very soon.
So another question that maybe relates to this one that could be on someone's mind, but okay, so I adopted this when it was made available, and I already have some conformance reports that are based on the VPAT 2.0 template. What do I do? Well, I would tell you, or in my opinion, I would say the standard that was effective at the time you created it was the revised Section 508 that is included in VPAT 2.0. So your report based on VPAT 2.0 is still good. It was based, your evaluation, your report was based on the standard at the time. So could you update it if you wanted to? Well, you certainly could. Your customer might ask you to do that, certainly. But as Mary Jo was just explaining, it really just became effective technically just the other day. So VPAT 2.1 now is how we evolved, is now includes these new TTY requirements. And so you would really be expected probably by the customer to include those requirements in your report as well going forward.
Yeah, just one more thing about that TTY and the 2.1. And honestly, if you don't have a communications product that needs to support TTY, then it's probably those requirements are in a not applicable section for your product anyway. So it really won't have any effect on the requirements you have to comply with.
All right. Thank you, Glenn and Mary Jo, for adding that. I don't see any other questions coming in, so why don't we proceed?
On this slide, I show a photo of echinacea flowers, and on top of one is a bee. There's a saying in IBM, "Be essential." So this section covers the essential requirements for authors of accessibility conformance reports. I also have some best practices that I want to cover as well. So first I want to just cover the overall outline, and we'll go into more detail later, but basically it starts out, your report will have basic information about your product. It will list the applicable standards that you're including in your report. And then comes the sections of the requirements and report. In the report, WCAG 2, the revised 508, the European EN 301549, and then at the end, the legal disclaimer if you have one. So we'll go into more detail in a bit. I also want to talk a little bit about the flexibility in reporting. You can actually deliver your accessibility conformance report in various formats. We provide the template in a doc format, in a Word format, but you can deliver it in PDF or HTML or any other way that you want to provide it electronically. We don't have any requirements for that. You can include all three standards in one report. You can split them out into multiple reports. Say you think it gets too long and you want to put your European standard report in one. Of course, you would have to include the WCAG table because the European standard includes WCAG. If you were just reporting on 508, if you were a US only company, you can just make a US Section 508 report that just has the WCAG and the 508 requirements in it. Or if you've got a web only product, or you're only wanting to provide WCAG compliance, you can make a report for that. You don't have to do all three reports. If you're a U.S.-based only company, you can do the report that makes sense to you. Not trying to create extra work for anybody, but when you have an international company like IBM or HP, we report on all three standards so that we can cover the worldwide market. So now I'll go into more details of the VPAT itself. First off, the VPAT has a table of contents in the beginning. It has 10 pages of instructions. So that was one of the big changes that Glenn already talked about. We wanted to make sure that there were plenty of instructions so folks know how to fill out the form and understand what the various fields are used for, what's required and what's recommended. And my recommendation to you is to read them. It's very helpful information. This is one way that we want to get consistency into reports from various vendors. That was one of the complaints of the original VPAT reports is that there was a lot of inconsistency, and it was hard for procurers to tell if this was a quality report or not. And so these instructions are to address some of these quality issues in the reports. But when you create your report, please delete the first 10 pages. They're going to be long enough as they are, so you can delete the instructions when you create your report. Then there's the registered service mark. And as Glenn said, if you're following the instructions, you need to make sure that you have that service mark in your report. The service mark is used for the spelled out version as well as for the acronym. So be sure to do that. And then there is a lot of required information in the conformance report. I'm not going to go into detail in this list. This slide just shows a list, but I will go into detail on the next several slides in the form of an example. But first, a few best practices. Glenn already talked a little bit about the notes, and it's used anytime that there might be a need for further explanation about your product. You can document any considerations that you have to the standards and conformance claims for standards. And there's notes for each subsection or chapter of the standard, so you can document the relevance of that chapter or section to your product. And when you don't include a section because the product doesn't contain any components that need to meet any of the requirements in that chapter. So when I give my example report, you'll see some examples of uses of notes. And one more best practice is, I really wanted to cover this in a little bit of detail for the evaluation methods used. When we got feedback from the U.S. government agencies, these are the kinds of things that they really would like to see in your documentation for what evaluation methods you used to verify the accessibility of your product. So if you tested based on general product knowledge, or if your product is similar to another tested product, they want you to talk about that. Whether or not you tested with assistive technologies, you can, if you wish, document which assistive technologies you tested with. If you use some sort of a test methodology, you should provide, the name of that methodology, who published it, and if there's a URL associated with that, a website associated with that, give them the URL of that so that they know, what test methods you use. And many companies have their own proprietary test methods, so they don't want to make publicly available how they go about testing their product. So this is where you would also document that, or any other notes that you'd like to provide about testing. So here's my example, and I just made up a dummy accessibility conformance report with a example company. I called my company ABC Inc. So, the title is ABC Inc. Accessibility Conformance Report. And it says it's the VPAT version 2.1, published in March of 2018. And so I gave a name of my product with the version number. It's my fake product, version 2.1, and a brief product description. So this product, my example product, is a web-based product, and it sends order and tracking information to customers, and it's all web-based with web-based electronic documentation. And the date that I put in, you'll have a date, is the date of your conformance report when you're publishing it. And there's also a spot for contact information. Now, I put a fake email here, but you can provide a phone number, address, any kind of contact information in case someone has questions about your conformance report, that they know who to contact and how to contact them. And then here's the first example of where to use notes. This particular product, I said, is a cloud-based product. Now, I get a lot of questions, and that's why I made this example. I get a lot of questions in IBM because we have a lot of cloud-based products and services. And so I made this example that it's a cloud-based product, and it's on a continuous delivery cycle. And that means, it's updated, sometimes daily, weekly, very fast iterations of updates to this product. So this report documents the accessibility conformance as of the date of the report. So that kind of is a little bit of a disclaimer saying, things may have changed a little bit because we're on a continuous delivery cycle. So things change over time, and the VPAT can be updated periodically, but you can't update it daily or weekly. So it just gives an indication of when you had, completed your test for that report. So the next section is evaluation methods used. And so I described here that in this example that I had used the trusted tester Section 508 compliance test process for applications. And that test process is published by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and I gave a link. So basically that was how I document my test process. In slide 43, I show an example of the applicable standards and guidelines. So there's a table in the VPAT form that shows it has the list of standards and possible standards and guidelines. This isn't displaying very well for some reason, but the report has either WCAG or 508 or the EN 301, 549. It could have all three, but basically in the left column, it lists those standards, and in the right column, it says included in the report, and you answer yes or no to whether you include WCAG level A, level AA, level AAA. In this example, I said yes to A and AA and no to AAA. and the revised 508 standards, I said, yes, I'm including that in this report. And for the EN 301549 standard, I say, no, it's not, not included. So my example is not going to include the European standard, so we can kind of get through this whole thing in our time frame. And we had talked about earlier that there are conformance levels that we have defined, and it's included in the report so that we're all using a common definition for what supports means, what supports with exceptions means, what does not support means, and then the other two are not applicable and not evaluated. Now, not evaluated, we established that we only want that particular answer used for WCAG 2.0 level AAA requirements to say if you had met or tested any of the AAA requirements. You're not required to include AAA, but sometimes there are maybe one or two AAA requirements that you meet and you tested for, and you want to document that in your accessibility conformance report so you can get credit for it, but you didn't test all of them and you didn't maybe implement all of them. So then you can say on the answers when you get to that table, not evaluated on the ones that you hadn't evaluated. As far as not applicable, not applicable means the criteria isn't relevant to the product. Now in WCAG, when you're reporting WCAG 2.0 conformance, WCAG doesn't have an answer of not applicable. They say if you don't have something, you know, like for example, you don't have multimedia content, that instead of saying not applicable, you say supports, because the requirements really, you support it. You don't have any of that content in your web application, and so you conform by not having to do anything. Okay, so we'll move on. So there's a standard section in the VPAT that talks about the WCAG 2 report and its applicability to not just WCAG, but also the European and 508 standards. You just kind of leave this in, but it kind of is there for explanatory purposes. And then we move on. Now we get to the technical requirements part of the form. First is the WCAG 2 report. It's Table 1 covers the Level A success criteria of WCAG 2.0. In the notes of my example product, I say this product uses WAIARIA to make scripted UI elements accessible. That sometimes is an important thing to know. You don't have to document that there, but you know, this is just an example. If there's any other product notes regarding Level A criteria, you can document that here. And so then there's a table with the 3 columns: criteria, conformance level, and remarks and explanations. And so I show the first criteria, which is 1.1.1, non-text content, which is a Level A criteria. And it also shows what it applies to in the other standards for non-web content and support documentation. So that all is kind of like the standard part of the VPAT template is the criteria column. And then in the conformance level column, you can say, you know, if for your web content that you support, or you know, whatever the conformance level is. For electronic documentation, you can document, you know, its level of support And in the case of my product, software, authoring tools, those other things don't apply. So I say that that's not applicable. And then in the remarks and explanations, because in my example for web, I said supports and electronic documentation, I said supports with exceptions. I have two different sets of remarks and explanations to explain each of those answers. And so for web, I say the product provides alternative text for all non-text content. So it indicates that we understood the requirement and that we met for the web content. And for electronic documentation, I said, I said it supports with exceptions, I said the installation diagram does not have alternative text. And you could document further workarounds or something like that. If there's additional instructions that have been published or something like that, you can actually document that there. Okay. So then there's the level AA criteria in table 2. And again, I have just the example of the first criteria there, which is 1.2.4 captions live. And in this case, there's no live audio content in the product, so I said supports. So this is where I use that WCAG thing, where even though you don't have the content, you can say that you support the criteria, because you actually do. There is nothing, there's no live audio content in this product. Oh, and I also, if you notice, I did not include the notes on this particular one. The notes, I didn't have any notes, so I just eliminated that line to save some space. So now I'm on slide 48. And here's another way to save space. Because in my example, I don't have any native software, it's all web-based software, there's a way to make the software section a little shorter. I do provide why in the notes. I said in the notes, portions of the software requirements are not applicable as indicated in the table below. And so then we have the table, and it shows that 501.1, which is the incorporation of WCAG to level AA, it refers to the WCAG section for those details. And then in the next line, it says 502 to 502.3, the software requirements are not applicable. And that's where that comes in. It's a web-only product with no software components. So that's what I put in the remarks to explain why I don't, have every single line in that table. It kind of helps you condense the table a little bit to only include the applicable requirements. And then it goes on to show the next header section, header of 503 applications. And so then you would continue through the table in that way. So more on saving space. If you have a whole section that doesn't apply, again, my example product is web-based. So the table in the hardware section can actually be omitted with a note explaining, this is not a hardware product. So in the notes, I say this section doesn't apply to the product as there's no hardware components. And that way, the reader of your report will know that you didn't just skip this section, you didn't include it for a reason. And then you can make your report so much shorter. And then finally comes the legal disclaimer. Now that's optional, you don't have to include it, but I did include one just for example purposes. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving you legal advice to the verbiage to put in there, but in this one, I just say that the company has made every attempt to ensure the accuracy and reliability of the information provided in the report as of the date of the report. And we can't guarantee that it's free from accessibility defects, but obviously this would be something probably your lawyers would put together if you are creating such a report. And lastly, totally essential, this is absolutely an essential part, is make your report accessible. Especially when you're delivering this in an electronic format, you want to make sure that everyone can read it. So make sure that you go through the trouble of ensuring that it's accessible. All right, so I think at this point I'll just tell you where to get the latest VPAT, and then we'll open it up for the longer questions. You don't get the VPAT. I have a picture here of Hobbiton. You don't get the VPAT at Hobbiton. You go and you get it at the ITI website. The slides have the link. It's in the resources section of their accessibility VPAT page. There is a download link for the VPAT with frequently asked questions, and we try to answer some of the questions there that we think that folks might have when they're approaching doing a conformance report using the VPAT, as well as a paper that we wrote, the ITI wrote, about reporting conformance to ICT accessibility standards. Now this white paper was all about addressing the question that some would like to see just a yes/no answer that you comply with standards, and it's far more complicated than that, because there are so many requirements, and you could just miss the mark on one or two of them, and you would have to say no. And so how much information does that give a procurer if everyone's answering no because they have these little nitpicky issues, or there's one or two things that they haven't addressed yet in their product? You want to make sure that they get full information, and the accessibility conformance report can also document workarounds and things like that answering yes or no just wouldn't provide. So at this point, let's see. I'll see if I think we can open up the floor to questions, and I see there are some posted in the chat.
Yes. So just one final reminder, those of you who are connected over the phone, we have a couple of questions queued up, so we're going to go through those, but then we will definitely give you a chance to unmute your lines. When we do get to that point, it's #6 to unmute, or you can send your questions quickly to webinars@accessibilityassociation.org, and I'll make sure we address those before we're out of time today. So we have a couple of great questions queued up from Heather. Heather's first question is, VPAT 2.0 allows for reporting out on web, electronic documents, software, as well as authoring tools. Is it okay to break those out into separate reports?
Maybe I'll respond first. This is Glenn. So Heather, that's a great question. Yes, you can. So we wanted to provide a format for reporting to conformance to a number of very important accessibility related standards. And so we did include them all in one template, right? One document, so you can see all of them. You could certainly, if you were reporting conformance to your website or to a website, right, and you wanted to meet WCAG 2.0 level AA, you can just do that.
Okay, and then we have two more questions from Heather. I'm going to do these one at a time because they're a little long. Both questions are related to the use of not applicable in Chapter 3 functional performance criteria. The first question, we'll use 302.4 and 302.5 as an example, but the question could apply to others. A couple of examples were listed. Is it appropriate for a product that has no audio at all to report as NA, or should it report fully supported because it has no audio requirement?
Also a very good question. So, and Mary Jo, you can supplement this or correct me. So the levels of support include, basically the four, basic conformance levels. In WCAG, you do have the ability, or by their rules, when something is not applicable, you can report that as supports. There's a lot of debate about that. And so in our template, we do explain that if you are reporting conformance to the WCAG requirements or WCAG requirements, within you can follow the WCAG rules or the WAI rules, and you can respond with supports. But in the other areas of a standard that's not WCAG, within you should not do that. Not applicable is exactly what it means, not applicable. Did I answer that?
And then the second part of that question, for products that by their nature are complex and require a high level of cognitive ability, can 302.9 be not applicable? Example, a knowledge base that is designed to help developers learn and implement accessibility solutions. It assumes that the user is fluent in both English as well as HTML.
So maybe there's a pause here, so maybe I'll jump out here first again. So this is Glenn. So certainly we could offer opinions, how the standards are interpreted or what the access board meant. I would say, even both of your questions here, Heather, it might be good to ask the access board and get their view on what they intended or what they meant. They do have, both Bruce and Tim, they travel about a lot, right? They speak in different places. You certainly getting their email addresses is somewhat easy to do, but I know because they mentioned this, that it's best not to send them an email. There is an email address for the access board.
Yeah, I agree. Anytime you do have any technical questions about
okay, and we do
the requirements themselves, they should be addressed to the U.S. Access Board, because we're just trying to provide the reporting template. The other thing I just wanted to say about functional performance criteria chapter itself, that's not essentially required unless you're trying to claim equivalent facilitation or the technical requirements don't cover or fully cover the technology that you're using. I think it'll probably be used quite rarely, at least at first. But this is in place so that if by chance the revised 508 standards become more outdated as technologies evolve, then you can use certainly the functional performance criteria to claim conformance of your product to accessibility standards.
All right, thank you, Glenn and Mary Jo. I do want to give everyone who's connected over the phone a chance to unmute now. I'll be able to see that if you do that. We do have one more question lined up, but I will watch to see if anyone unmutes so that we can get to you as soon as we answer that question. And again, really quickly, if you can squeeze it in, you can send those questions to webinars@accessibilityassociation.org. So we do have one final question in the chat from Rachel. She asks, could you provide examples of what supports means by one method that meets the criterion? What would qualify or not qualify as one method?
So this is Glenn. I guess I'll provide a response to that. Again, I would maybe qualify that by saying I think this is my opinion. And I'll start by this way. Certainly, if you want to explain in your report, and I don't know if you're an author of a report or you're the consumer of a report, but certainly for the people that author reports, you could elaborate what supports means and what one method means in your notes area. All right. So if you want to explain that to the readers, you can certainly do that. That's a good place to do that. So I would answer that more definitively by saying I think a good way to interpret this, because many products are very complex, especially when we're talking about information communication technology. So when we're talking about a product supports a particular requirement, oftentimes it's good to think of it, I believe, as what is the main purpose of the product and what are the primary use cases of the product. And so when you look at it through that lens, does the product support that particular requirement is kind of how I would suggest, and so, okay, so does it support it? Well, that's depends on your evaluation method, in your opinion, or the experts, right? It should be done by experts who know how to evaluate, right? And so you can determine something supports. One method that meets the criterion, that specific way of doing that, or what that means to me would be, you could support it any number of ways, but you at least need to have one method. And if you at least have one method, then you can say supports. The product may not support it in every way, because a product may have a couple of ways of doing something. But if you at least have one method that meets the criterion, then you can say supports.
I can also, this Mary Jo, I can give
there.
a little bit of an example in our technologies. One is complex visualizations of data. Those are notoriously difficult to make accessible to someone who's blind. So providing, tabular information that might provide the same kind of insight that someone would be looking for would be, an alternative way. So that's one way to do it. So they wouldn't necessarily be able to access directly the complex visualization, but there is a way for them to gain that same kind of insight in another method. So that's kind of the way it's covered. I hope that gives you a better idea.
Looks like we might have at least one more question coming in. Again, those of you over the phone, this is your chance. We'll just give... okay, so Heather asks, could the speakers repeat the changes from VPAT 2.0 to VPAT 2.1?
It's the TTY that was added back in January of 2018, the one that was published really recently. It's 5 additional requirements, I think, which was in the original 508, but they had originally wanted to put in real-time text requirements, but it did not get agreed upon, which standards to use, what was the best way to tackle that in the requirements. So they removed that and had not replaced it with the original requirements for TTY. And so that was to correct that. That's essentially the only change in the VPAT. And somebody also mentioned, and I wanted to mention it to the rest in case they didn't see the chat, is that it looks like the VPAT 2.1 is available on the ITI website. So it's live.
All right. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think that concludes our session. A huge thank you to Glenn and Mary Jo. This was a really great, very informative presentation, and I know we certainly appreciated it at IAAP, and I'm sure our audience appreciated it as well. So thank you for that. Thank you for our captionist, especially getting back in and connected. Thank you, all of our attendees, for bearing with us as well. We do have a couple of announcements before we close today. The first being that the M-Enabling Summit 2018 is coming up very soon, and that this year's theme is Accessible Technology and Environments for All. A couple of key topics that we're going to be focusing on this year: artificial intelligence and robotics, augmented and virtual reality, aging in place, web accessibility, integrating accessibility into third-party services, autonomous mobility, consumer tech products and the Internet of Things, smart cities, higher education, and workplaces. So the M-Enabling Summit is coming up on June 11th through the 13th. That will be in Washington, D.C. We have a link there for the M-Enabling website. You can visit that for more information or to register. And for those of you that are IAAP members who are attending today, you do get a slight discount on your registration fees, so make sure you look for that. You can always send us a question if you don't know how to take advantage of that. It's info@accessibilityassociation.org, and we'll be able to help you out there. In addition to that, we have a feedback survey, so we really appreciate hearing from you. We like to know how we're doing on these webinars, how we can improve, and what topics you'd like to see for next year. So go ahead and select that link, the top link on this page right now. We'll also send you that survey in the follow-up email if you don't have a chance to do it right now. We really appreciate hearing from you. As we mentioned at the beginning, this session, along with all of our previous webinars, are always recorded, and those are available in our archive library. That second link on the page will take you to our archived webinars, where you can see our whole library. You can download a few in bundles, and we really hope you take advantage of that. Coming up for the rest of the 2018 webinar series, Thursday, April 26th, we have Accessible Solutions for the Deaf, Hard of Hearing, and Individuals with Hearing Loss in the Workplace. That's going to be with Alana Beal at Sprint, and I really hope to see you there. This is a fairly new topic for us, so we're pretty excited about that one. And then coming up on Thursday, May 17th, we're going to have Accessible Document Design in Higher Education, and that's with Karen McCall. She's presented with us a couple of times, always a great session, so we hope to see you there as well. That concludes our session today. Thank you everyone for attending, and again, thank you to Glenn and Mary Jo. To close out of the Adobe room, you don't have to do anything special. If you're over the phone, you can just hang up. If you are connected through the Adobe Connect platform itself, you can just close out of that browser tab or the Adobe Connect app, however you're connected. So that concludes our session.